folks. Thank you so much for inviting me out here to Milledgeville. It was actually my first time in the area, so I was having a really nice drive from Darien, Georgia, seeing all the different things. Finally getting out of the coastal marsh. I love it when my job takes me out of the marsh. As beautiful as it is, it's always good to get something refreshing going every once in a while. So, as mentioned, my name is Ranger Allen. I work at Fort King George, which is a state historic site for Georgia's DNR. We operate in Darien, Georgia, which is considered the second oldest town in the Georgia colony. What I do is primarily, they call me an interpretive ranger. That doesn't mean I do sign language. Unfortunately, I'm very bad at sign language. I mean, I can do thank you, and that's about it. No, mostly what they have me interpreting is history. And so as the local historian of Fort King George, I'm responsible for doing all sorts of programming, the festivals, junior ranger camps, as well as outreach, going from place to place, talking about our Georgia history as well as Fort King George history. And I have a history degree, bachelor's in history. I also have a master's in archaeology. So it was almost as if I was setting myself up to be a historian, right?
Now, have you been a ranger at any other locations?
I have traveled to a couple of other different sites like FDR, Little White House. I've worked extensively on the coast in what we call Region 6. So that's Wormslow, Skidaway, Crooked River, Hoffel Broadfield, which is an 1800s historic plantation. Also Fort McAllister, which is a Civil War era site. But primarily I just love Fort King George because while we'll get to discover a little bit about the fort, it's not just British history. There is 1,000 years of history at Fort King George that I love to dabble in. So if I'm not feeling up to wearing some of these wool clothes like you see me wearing today, well, next thing you know, I could talk about the Guale Indians who were there for centuries. I could do Spanish missionary and talk about Spaniards. I could even do Scottish Highlanders. So what I like to do is start off with just basically where we are. If everybody can see this, we're in Darien. Has anyone ever actually been out to the coast on Darien? Yeah, it's a small, quaint, quiet little town, but it is growing nowadays. So Darien, it was established in 1736, of course, by General James Oglethorpe, who was one of the main leaders of the Georgia Charter. James Oglethorpe himself, very interesting character. He's very widely known as a philanthropist out in England. He was a very wealthy gentleman. He was in Parliament. There's some interesting stories about him being possibly a Jacobite spy, working against the crown, and lots of interesting, intriguing stories that I think would make for very good, entertaining television. But we'll see if that ever comes to fruition. But after he was responsible for running the Jails Committee in the 1720s, which was an investigation into London's horrific prison system, where a lot of the poor and those who fell into debt, sometimes for as simple as essentially $1 of debt, they could end up in prison for the rest of their lives. And what happened was Oglethorpe's best friend, an artist, he ended up in prison, he ended up getting sick, and he passed away. And that really spurred him into his philanthropy kind of mindset. And he investigated these jails and realized he needed to get the poor out of England and into a new area where they could thrive as functioning citizens. And that's how he started the Georgia Colony Charter. And what he did actually was very ingenious. He looked to the Scottish Highlanders.
Real quick question.
Yes.
Did he have to pay for his charter? So a lot of times they have to pay for their troops and their charter. And
a lot of it, he actually had to mortgage off some of his own property to the crown because he believed in the Georgia colony so much he was willing to put up his own livelihood at stake. Luckily for him, it actually ended up pretty well for him. We have the Georgia state later on. Yeah. But he was also very intelligent by trying to figure out the best settlers for the Georgia colony. He looked to the Scots. And the Scots at the time had lost a lot of their rights. If you think back to the American colonists who were facing these high taxes without representation, a lot of that same thing is going on in the 1717 and 1720s, where they had been fighting against the crown as Jacobites, trying to reinstate their own Stuart line. Didn't work out well for them, and so Parliament punished them by taking away a lot of their civil liberties, including their right to own weapons, their right to their historic ancestral targe, which is their shields, their right to tenant farming. And so the Highland area is being invaded almost by British Londoners, and their way of life as they know it is slowly disappearing. And Oglethorpe sends Scottish officers to the Highlands to recruit these different families, saying, hey, got a new colony, we're going to reinstate your rights if you come out and you're willing to settle it. And a lot of them agreed. Dozens of families, including Macintosh, where we get Macintosh County. Also Lachlan Macintosh, when he was a boy, he actually ended up immigrating to Darien with his father, John Moore Macintosh. And as we know, he's a Revolutionary War hero. So Darien was 1736, and it grew out of the Scottish immigration into lumber mills. So we have a lot of different lumber milling and sawmilling history that goes for about 200 years, actually, in Darien. And then eventually that faded away, and Darien is now known as a shrimping and oystering industry. It's still a very beautiful place to go to in vacation. It's very quiet. Otherwise, I like to focus a little bit more on our site specifically. We're just a little bit shy of Darien, about a mile away down the road. So our site's history is a long period of time. What we primarily focus on is the 1500s, and I know you probably can't really read that from here, so I don't mind reading that aloud. So the first bullet point here was 1565 to 1680s. That was the Spanish missionary time period. So St. Augustine was coming up from La Florida. They were establishing Franciscan missionary sites all along the coastline, mainly to supply the St. Augustine capital, and also to assimilate all of the Guale natives, as well as the Timucua, the Macoma, and the Asau, as well as other Native Americans. But primarily on our site, we focus on the Guale ancestry. Unfortunately, when you go to different civilizations and you tell them you're doing your whole life the wrong way, they're going to rebel against that. And so instead of being indentured slaves, essentially what it was going on here, they rebelled under Chief Juanillo, who got a lot of his loyal followers and kin together, and in 1597, they actually went to Father Pedro de Corpa, leader of the Santo Domingo de Talaje mission on our site, and they beheaded him and put his head out on a stake as a warning to the Spaniards, saying enough was enough. We are our own people. We're going to practice our own ways. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that all of the Guale agreed to it, because they understood that if they fought Spain, they wouldn't win. So a lot of the Guale scattered after that. And of course, Juanillo was eventually put down by the governor of Florida. And about 1660s, missionaries had kind of given up in that area. They understood the Guale to be much more radicalized than a lot of the other natives. And of course, now that you're introducing European diseases, about 90% of Native American populations had died after European contact. And if you put that in context, Black Death in Europe is about 60% mortality of Europeans. Now, you're looking at 90% of Native Americans on the coast and throughout North America. So it's really disintegrated and fractured a lot of the tribes, and the Guale disappeared from historic record by 1700s. After that, on our site, it was pretty much abandoned, so you had Colonel Barnwell come in, and that's when we start seeing the development of the British fort system along the Altamaha River. So 1721 to 1727 were the official dates of Fort King George, and you think to yourself, that's not a long time for a fort to be around, and there's a good reason why, which we'll get into. And after that, the fort was disbanded. 9 years later, you had Oglethorpe come in with the Highlanders. Originally, it was New Inverness. They decided to recall it Darien after a failed Scottish settlement in the Panama. And then After that, we have the next biggest historic event in Darien was the burning of Darien in 1863. If anybody's ever watched the film Glory with Matthew Broderick as Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, it did take place in Darien, and they actually filmed a portion of that 1989 movie in Darien. But he came in with the 54th Massachusetts Voluntary Infantry, which is one of the first all-black Civil War regiments. And it was led by Robert Gould Shaw, who was a Massachusetts native, and his whole family goes back to abolitionism and feminism, and so he was chosen to lead that all-black regiment because they knew he was capable of leading them and considering them in a more humanitarian light. And he didn't want to burn Darien, but he also told his men, listen, I'm not going to court-martial you and put you on the spot if you don't want to do it. I don't want to burn an abandoned town. It's pointless. So you can step to the side. Nothing's going to happen to you. You're not going to be court-martialed. So he's actually a very good person. Next biggest thing is, well, Darien starts to grow. Yep.
A quick question.
Yeah.
Why was, and I saw Glory in Disney.
Yeah.
Why was he ordered, and why did he have to burn an abandoned town?
So as part of Sherman's March to the Sea, of course, which was, Union idea of finally putting a stop to Confederacy, is, marching through all the way to Savannah and other towns and, violently halting the rebellion, according to them. And so Darien was on the list of places to be burned. Now, the Darien folk actually had been given advance notice, so the town was abandoned at the time. And it was Colonel Montgomery who also went into Darien alongside Robert Gould Shaw, and he was really gung-ho for it. He was definitely following orders. He's like, let's burn this place. So Montgomery's troops looted Darien, of course, just picking up furniture and whatnot, and Robert Gould Shaw standing to the side going, this is distasteful. Why are we doing this? There's no point. At some point, we're going to leave Darien, and all these women and children are going to come back to burned houses. I'm not going to do it. And so he didn't do it. And he told his troops of freed men who were basically going back to the south to kind of rescue their families at that point. And he told them, you don't have to do it. We're not going to do this. It's pointless. Besides, the other colonel is already doing it. So technically the orders are being fulfilled. So that was really the reasoning behind it. And in fact, there's only one building in Darien to have withstood fire. It's called the Adams Strain building, which is currently under renovation. And they actually let me into that, and they were doing archaeology in the basement, and they found the burn line from the 1863 fire. So we could actually see that archaeologically, but it was the only building in Darien to really remain after that. But Darien picked up after that, and it started becoming a haven for different sawmill industries, including industries run by freed black men. And so coastal Georgia was starting to become really economically lucrative for black people as well as white people. And Darien itself had a thriving black community of very rich, wealthy black elites who both owned churches, they formed charity organizations, they formed schools. Darien was really one of those odd instances in Georgia where you saw a little bit more harmonious relations between the two during the Jim Crow era. And then, of course, after the sawmill industry fell due to lumbering and the Great Depression, we had not really a whole lot going on. But it was Miss Bessie Lewis in the 40s and 50s who started researching all of the area. She did a lot of the archaeological research. She found the original Fort King George, and in 1948, the land itself was deeded to Georgia State Parks and Historic Sites. And from that point on, we became a historic attraction, an educational center, and a custodian of that land. So that's basically the generic timeline of Darien and Fort King George. Now, as I mentioned, we go all the way back to the Spanish missions. All these pictures are taken on site at a lot of our festivals with some of our reenactors as well. We have the reconstructed Guale roundhouse, which is some of the original types of buildings that the Guale themselves would have lived in. It's a tabby structure of wattle and daub, meaning they wove or waddled the reeds together and then daubed it with a mud and oyster shell fixture, which is how we get a lot of our famous tabby stuff, tabby architecture in the coastal Georgia. It comes back from the Guale natives. Some of the easiest thing you can make out of just lime shell, some good mud or clay, and eventually Europeans started making it more into a concrete mixture, but you'll still see tabby ruins in Darien today.
So that's the original tabby?
That's not the original tabby. That is a reconstruction using a lot of resources. So unfortunately, a lot of resources.
The idea is original.
Yeah.
Right? That's the idea.
Yeah.
Came from those Indians.
Oh, yeah. And it's just a small circular building with thatched roof. So a lot of our resources are from a very Spanish perspective, but we use those primary resources to rebuild a lot of these buildings because I don't know about you, but I can read a history book. It's one thing to actually go to that site, go into that building and experience the way of life that these people did. It brings it to the forefront, and the kids enjoy it too. Right. Absolutely enjoy it. So as I mentioned, there was a rebellion that ended up with Father Pedro de Corpa beheaded. And of course, the missionaries were never quite able to reestablish themselves, and they actually were slowly going south and south. They went back to Cumberland Island, which is a huge Spanish missionary capital along the coast. And eventually, they wound up going to Amelia Island was the next one, and then they sort of kind of disappeared from the Georgia coast, and it was now just Florida territory was Spanish territory, which, thankfully for us British at the time, since I am dressed as a traitorous redcoat, that's exactly when Colonel Barnwell decides that there needs to be some British fortifications. So you've got Spain in the south, you've got France to the west, and now you have Native Americans who are trying to regain their homelands. From the Carolinas, which is the southernmost British frontier at the time, at any moment, you can have enemies coming up into the Carolinas and causing a lot of damage for the settlers. And so Barnwell, who was living at Port Royal, South Carolina at the time on his own plantation, he wrote to Parliament in the 1720s and he goes, listen, we need a line of fortifications on the southern boundary of Altamaha River. Parliament was like, wow, that's, thank you, Barnwell. You're a war hero. We're glad to hear from you. We're broke. Can't afford it. And like Oglethorpe, Barnwell goes, you know what? I'm a wealthy man. I'll fund it myself. So he gathers his own team of sawyers. He gets his own enslaved individuals from his fort. And they go to the mouth of the Altamaha and place a test site. They call it Fort King George after King George I of England, which we know we fought the Revolutionary War against King George III. Georgia Colony, King George II. They were not very creative in naming their royals in England, so it's always a very interesting facet of British royalty. But here we actually have some of the original blueprints that Barnwell himself drafted. He was a very famous surveyor at the time. So he was taking a lot of these ideas of all these different New England forts, as well as castle structure from Old England, and he was using that to rebuild a whole fortification out of the local materials of cypress. So our main building, especially when you look at our photos and you go there, it's going to be the blockhouse, which is that triangular building. Absolutely gorgeous. It's about 3.5 stories tall. Originally, it would have had ladders going into it, but instead, when they rebuilt it in the 1980s, they put stairs in there, and that's mostly for your convenience, for our visitors, as well as the intern ranger, because I don't know if I could go up ladders for the rest of my day and my job. I don't know. I couldn't do it. My knees would hate me. So on the ground floor here, we've got I don't know if we could see it, right here. This is the ground floor, or what they might call the basement. It's got 2 rooms. It's got the jail cell for any prisoners of war, and it's got the powder magazine, black powder. And right above it, you would have what we call the cannon floor or the gun floor. That's where we have a lot of our cannons there, which are operable, and we do fire them for events. But you'll see these slightly bigger windows. That's where you can roll the cannon up and fire it from all four sides of the blockhouse. We also have on the next floor, that third floor, is the musket floor. And you'll notice there's this odd overhang. And you'll see here, this is a close-up of it. They call that matriculation. Comes from old European castles. And if you ever being laid siege at a European castle, you've got the army invading, trying to break through the gate. They open up that port and they throw hot tar on their enemies. It's the same style. We've got these little holes, I don't know if you can see them, but these cutouts right on the floor. They just have to take that out, take their muskets, or even take their pistols, and they can fire on any enemy that's trying to break through the door. And I'll actually pass this around. It's not loaded, but it just gives you an idea of the weapons. Now, if you run out of ammunition, you've got somebody trying to break through, well, then you can take your shoe off, throw it at them, hopefully hit him in the head. Again, when you've got the powder room right on the side of 5 inches of cypress, you got your enemy with a torch. You don't want your blockhouse to go sky high. It's got all your soldiers in there defending it. Bad news. So they're going to have all these cool defensive techniques and defensive structures to this blockhouse to keep not only from an enemy ship from even making it landside, you're going to make sure that nobody can run up and catch you unawares. You also have at the very top, which is where we call the half structure, is what we have on the inside called a catwalk. And on a clear day, if you're looking out through one of them towards the riverside, you can see St. Simon's Island in the distance. Today, you can actually make out the lighthouse from the edge of the island. But actually, when Barnwell was done building the blockhouse in 1721, he was looking up at that catwalk, and he's writing in his diary going, "There's an island out there. Should have built the fort there. Too late, Barnwell, sorry." But interestingly enough, Oglethorpe, later on when he's establishing Darien, he's reading Barnwell's diaries as notes, and he sees the mention of an island. He goes out there with a team of sailors, and they found Fort Frederica on St. Simon's Island. So the history is very connected, and thankfully Barnwell was writing down all of his thoughts and the entire journey of building this fort, because we can display it in our museum. We could also, see just from the palisade walls being put in all the way to the garrison coming in. And of course, all the different types of defensive structures. We rebuilt the fort in the 1980s. So it's got a couple of main methods of defense, including the pistol that's being passed around. We've got the palisades or the walls with sentry boxes. So your soldier is out there in the Georgia heat for 12 hours a day, either learning the drill or up in one of those sentry boxes, wearing all of this, basically baking. Otherwise, you might be on cannon crew. We've got 3, 4, and 6 pound cannons that are operable at our site, including what we call swivel guns, because they're these smaller guns that are on a swivel, so they have a wide range of motion. And of course, our largest one, our 6 pound, can go up to a mile's distance if it were actually loaded. State park, we don't actually use live rounds, but I know in some national parks they can do that. We haven't been able to do that, though. They also had their muskets, or the brown bess, which is typically what a lot of the American Revolution folks, on both sides, both British as well as the Patriots, were using brown besses, including all the way up to the Civil War, too. They were pretty reliable, about 50, 75 caliber type. In fact, I've got different things for y'all if you want to see what that is. So that's the caliber musket ball and the cartridge they would have made. You look like you were about to come up and hit it.
Well, you are British, right?
I know, I gotta be careful of you.
Tell me why he's called Tuscarora.
Tuscarora Jack. Yeah, that was his nickname because he was involved in the Tuscarora Indian Wars. He was, of course, in the military. They chose him to lead it at the time. He did not like the Tuscarora Indians. And he writes extensively about how much he does not like them. And you had the Tuscarora's fighting the Yamasee, which were friends, kind of friends of the British. They were good trade partners. And so when you have the Tuscarora coming in, who are also going, hey, y'all are settling on our lands, we want them back, please leave. Are the British going to leave at that point? No. So these tensions got to be so high that it was called upon to basically start a war with them. The Tuscaroras were decimated by Colonel Barnwell, and a lot of them ended up fleeing and joining a lot of the Iroquois relatives.
Right.
Some of them even turned to a type of piracy where they were raiding other Indian villages and carting the folks off into slaves to Spanish Florida. So that's when a lot of the British were like, no, you can't be doing that to our loyal trade relationships. No. So Barnwell was basically the leader and the hero. They called him Tuscarora Jack. Jack for James. And he just never really liked Tuscarora folk. But he did a lot with Britain, trying to bring the Yamasee back to Britain and kind of pay them honor for helping in those battles. Parliament didn't quite care at the time, so unfortunately the Yamasee ended up defecting to Spain anyways. So we got some stuff being passed around. Another defensive portion. I also like to pass this around. It's kind of cool. Here you go, I'll trade you. It's not a brown. I wouldn't eat that though. So one of the positions in the British Royal Army was someone called a grenadier. And so what did they have? Grenades. So I've got a portion of an old-fashioned 1700s grenade right there. And what I like to say is usually the grenadier was chosen in a very odd fashion. Basically, whoever was the craziest person in the regiment, the loudmouth, the kind of bully, the one who was doing daredevil stunts, they'd likely be promoted to grenadier because what would happen is they'd strap themselves with these grenades. And they have to be crazy because if you're strapped with dozens of pounds of black powder and one day you strike up your pipe to do some smoking, next thing you know, he might blow himself sky high. So being a grenadier was also a very short-lived profession, but it was one of those kinds of last-ditch resorts in case you had an enemy make landfall to take the fort. You start lighting those grenades up and throwing them, and hopefully you'll get them off of your property as fast as possible. Fortunately for the soldiers, they never actually saw battle. There is a story that in the middle of the night, they heard some musket fire off the river, and so they did what they were trained to do. They rallied forth, gathered in the blockhouse, pulled the ladders up behind them, started getting the cannons and muskets ready, fired out into the dark. Lo and behold, in the morning, there was nothing there. So I actually think it was some Native Americans sailing past taking pot shots at the blockhouse, probably to make them waste some black powder. So, I mean, if that were my land, I'd probably do that too. Patriots did that as well. Just start taking pot shots at the British. They're easy to pick out in the woods, so hey. We have more than the blockhouse. We have other buildings, of course, that goes lending a hand to the fort garrison's life. We've got right up here this slightly longer building. That is the officers' barracks, which could accommodate 5 to 8 commissioned officers. And of course, back then, it was usually the wealthy gentlemen of British society who were paid to get their own title. So you didn't have to use merit all the time. If you were a rich son, or possibly even the 7th son of a very rich family who wouldn't inherit anything, they would buy a commission for him so that he could gain rank, get his own money, get his own land that way, instead of relying on it on the will. And if they grew tired of their position, they could sell their rank off to the next aspiring hopeful and say, all right, I'm going to work my way up. You can have fun at the fort. Oh, you'll enjoy it. Another building, which is not quite pictured here, but it's kind of on the side, more on the left-hand side. That is the enlisted barracks. It's a very long building. It can hold up to 50 to 100 soldiers. And you'll notice on the very inside, ooh, what's going on? There you go. You'll notice on the inside we have all of these bunk beds. So with 50 to 100 men, we only have 26 beds to go around. So it was a hotbed system. You're usually sleeping 2 to 3 to a bed, which, I mean, in the wintertime, that's pretty nice. But when winter is only about 2 weeks long in the coast of Georgia,
You better like that guy, too.
you better like that. That better be your buddy, because y'all are snuggling up pretty tight.
No, thank you.
Not only that, but people back then only bathed maybe twice a year.
Boy.
Yes.
No,
So
thank
things got smelly and crowded. It's smoky in there. And of course, these enlisted soldiers were usually poor gentlemen off the streets of London. To be enlisted means you sign your life away to guarantee a roof over your head, clothes on your back, and food in your belly, as His Majesty's army gives you. And so a lot of these gentlemen were in the poor health to begin with. They were over 30 years old. They were often veterans of foreign campaigns, so they were maimed or disabled. And they were called by other regiments the Invalid Regiment. So after Barnwell's building that fort, he calls up Parliament again and says, I need a garrison. I've built the fort. I need troops to man it. And Parliament was like, I didn't actually think he'd do it. We're still broke. But we've got all of these lazy soldiers just lying around in our British forts. Why don't we just give them to you, the surplus soldiers? And so that's what they did. They took all of these soldiers of the 41st Regiment, put them on a ship, didn't tell them where they were going, shipped them off to the New World on a good journey. You're looking at 28 days if you're super lucky. If you're not lucky, which is normal, 48 days at sea. The invalid soldiers ended up getting scurvy along the way. They had to be hospitalized in South Carolina. A lot of them didn't make it. And of course, by the time that they were healthy enough to be put on a ship again, they were sent 3 days south to Fort King George in the middle of nowhere. And Barnwell welcomed them and said, build the rest of the fort, including our barracks. And then he left. He went back to Port Royal. And so you had all these older gentlemen working to build the rest of their barracks, and they had no idea what the coastal environment would be like. And so not only are they getting heat stroke and heat exhaustion, they're not used to malaria. So as the mosquitoes out there are biting them, they're dying from disease. Their rations, their food itself, which is basically dried everything, including salted porks and salted meats. Their bread was hardtack, which if you hold that, you'll realize why it's called hardtack. It's a twice-baked bread, and that was what you could do to ship food, 3-day boat ride south that has to come to them not molded or rancid. So their food itself is of poor quality, no nutrients whatsoever. So they're getting scurvy again. They're getting dysentery. If you ever played Oregon Trail back as a kid, do not pass Kansas River, you get dysentery. Also, I'll mention here in this picture right here, that's the privy where one of our reenactors is standing next to. It's a 4-seater. Because again, if you're sleeping 2 to 3 to a bed, there's no such thing as privacy. Oh no, not at all. And so when you have dysentery running amok throughout
There's a line going out that door.
Pretty much, yes. Although I'll hand it to Barnwell, he was quite intelligent enough to build it right on the river, and our river is tidal, so it's a flush mechanism at least twice a day. And that's also why he built it next to the enlisted soldiers' barracks and not the officers' barracks, so that the wealthy officers didn't have to smell it beyond those 2 flushes a day with 100 soldiers with dysentery. So, other than that, we also have a doctor's quarters. Fort King George is the second fort in the British colonies to have a full-time doctor on staff. The first one is in New York. Traditionally, when you build a fort, it's close enough to a town that if your soldier gets sick, you just call upon the town doctor. Not here in no man's land. So the doctor stayed there 24/7 taking care of these dozens of sick soldiers, and we knew at least 8 doctors passed through that quarter in the 6 years the fort was around, so lets you know the turnover rate is astronomical for the doctor. I also do a lot of colonial medicine programs, and the way I see it, why that's so high is if you're sworn to save people and it's not working out, you're probably going to leave, and for your own psychological welfare. We don't know for sure if the doctors were also getting sick. It's very probably likely true. But we do know a lot of them just left after a few months. It was just a hard, difficult job. Other buildings we have to do other sorts of programming as well. Blacksmithy, carpenter shop, an outdoor kitchen. We do utilize a lot of those, as well as a dock that the sailors would have had a sloop to tie up so they could keep scouting the rivers for any enemies, or just go and get rations or trade messages back and forth with Charlestown, Carolina. But at the end in 1727, we lost 147 soldiers to disease alone. Never saw battle. It was all malaria, dysentery, scurvy, and just poor diet. Drunkenness was also common. Again, I mean, when your morale is so low, we actually think that they opened up their own distillery in the enlisted barracks to give them something to do. Not only were they drinking their rum rations, they were making beer just to get through the day. So probably taking that hardtack and making beer with it, because I can't really chew on it. So, and the British are really good at brewing things. So we actually have this graveyard out there at the fort. Those tombstones were donated by the Daughters of the American Revolution as well, because back in the 60s, it was common for a lot of teenagers to go out and throw tombstones into the river. For some reason, we've got fences now that doesn't happen. People are a lot more educated about why those tombstones are there, so it doesn't happen, but a lot of them were just kind of lost in the river. Today, though, going beyond the British soldiers, so again in 1727, Parliament said enough was enough. We've lost 147 of our soldiers. Not that we liked them anyways. They're gone. There's been a fort fire. The blockhouse burned at least twice. And an investigator was called out there going, hey, why did it burn down? Colonel said, I can't prove the soldiers did it, but they did nothing while the fire was burning. So they just stood there waiting to go home. So Parliament says, you've got a mutiny on your hands. Enough's enough. It's in British hands now. The territory is ours. Dismantle the fort. Take it elsewhere. The garrison's gone. That's it. That was the end of the fort. They left the walls there and a pup tent for some soldiers, and that was it. Then, of course, we get Darien, 1736 with Oglethorpe. And after that, you saw 200 years of sawmilling. So they utilized that bluff. All that cypress trees, live oaks, yellow pine was perfect for lumbering. Part of our nature trail is very straight, and that's because it was part of the old railway station. So they were logging things about 3 miles upriver, shipping it on the railway, and going right into the heart of our site, where we had several different sawmilling companies throughout the ages. I didn't put one up there. There's San Sevilla Union. It wasn't on our site, but it was kind of next door. That was a African-American-led sawmill site. So again, going back to the fact that you had a lot of rich, wealthy black folk out there in Darien. And so they're also getting ahead on this whole adventure and this business. Of course, Great Depression fails. A lot of people's businesses go out. And not only that, but deforestation had pretty much logged all of the good lumber. And so the sawmilling industry came to an end. We do have a lot of those ruins on our site, so those are original. Today, we do a lot of really fun things. We do annual activities. Our next one is Scottish Heritage Days, going back to our Scottish ancestry to help build Darien. That's in March 15th and 16th. We do Memorial Day and July festivities, July 4th. We also do Girl Scout activities. whole bunch of really cool things. October when we start picking up business again, so we do Echoes on the Altamaha is a brand new program I introduced where we take you out in the dark at a full moon, station to station, where you get to talk to figures of the past. So you get to talk to Spanish missionaries, you get to talk to Scottish settlers, you get to talk to the British doctor, and it's all under a full moon by candle lantern light, and it's seen a lot of success for the first time we implemented it. We hope to increase it. It's just bringing that fort to a whole different perspective at night. Again, we do trick streets and tricorns for the kids, trick-or-treating at the fort. They love it. Autumn encampment is our biggest colonial fair. We also do Hogmanay, which is Scottish New Year's. So we get a whole bunch of people dressed in plaid, and we get to enjoy a cannon firing, and we sing Auld Lang Syne. It's just really cool out there, as well as different monthly programming, including all that black powder that we use. Do a lot of cannon firings, musket firings, different crafting, colonial crafting. And even though it was a men's military site, we do a lot of women's crafting out there, like sewing, weaving, the little spinning wheel. My naturalist Deanna absolutely loves using it. We're also doing a women's women during the Revolutionary War time. That's in March 8th, a Friday, which also celebrates International Women's Appreciation Day. So we're actually doing something like that in March to celebrate all the different things that women did in the 1700s. And even more, like junior ranger camps. I get kids out there all the time. We spend a week together learning about the history, doing science experiments, looking for birds. It's a whole lot of fun. But yeah, Fort King George is absolutely amazing. And we hope to actually have you out there if you want. I mean, it's not that far. And again, come out and see us for all these festivities. But thank you so much for letting me ramble on at you. And thank you again for this coin. I'm going to add it to my collection and maybe put my button on one of my outfits. Maybe on the inside so nobody knows that I'm a patriot on the inside. So. But thank you again so much.
Thank you.
Even in George Washington War, they read
Yeah.
one time. So.
We got some questions.
Yes, of course.
I'm curious. I went to a lecture last night on Sapelo.
Yeah.
And, of course, it was also the Scottish that came to Sapelo, the Macintoshes and those. Now, was there any relationship between Darien and Sapelo or Cumberland Highlands?
Yeah, in fact, the term Sapelo comes from Zapalo, which is a Spanish word for what the Guale themselves called Sapelo Island, again with a very Spanish flair. So was it really called Sapelo? Not really, it's just what the Spanish thought they were saying. So Sapelo was a very big Spanish missionary site. And in fact, when that rebellion was going on where Father Pedro lost his life, a lot of the Guale, when they fled, they went to Sapelo with a couple of other friars, because again, they still felt themselves to be Catholic at that point. They're wanting to avoid the inevitable violent end as Spain would come up from Florida and just kind of put a stop to all of them, whether or not they were involved. We don't know. So again, Sapelo has that history. It's also one of the last holdouts of the Gullah Geechee hammocks. So you've got hog hammock out there. And the Gullah Geechee were descendants of the freed slaves. And they settled on Sapelo, and where a lot of the Golden Isles were kind of bought out by all these resorts. And it's not a very kind history of how they did that. It was a lot of getting people drunk and pretending to pay them, but really they were stealing a lot of that land. Hog hammock is one of the last few to hold out. There's currently a situation going on. Again, you've got a lot of rich people coming around, and it's this history coming back to the surface again. But they are very proud to be out there, and it's absolutely beautiful, as you saw being out at Sapelo. But it does have a close tie with everything here. It's very natural and rugged and wild still to this day. I've been out there a few times. Yeah.
Well, I know they got into a lot of cotton farming.
Yeah.
And around Darien,
Mhm.
were there plantations where
Oh,
you
yeah.
had cotton?
Butler Island is just south of Darien, and Pierce Butler was known for having one of the most horrendous auctions of enslaved individuals. It was called the Weeping Times, and it happened right at Pierce Butler's plantation.
Yeah.
And it was the greatest amount of slaves sold in America at the time. It happened right across from Darien at Pierce Butler. And you can actually still go there today, and they have a smokestack right on the side of the road where they were doing rice production at first. They tried doing cotton. Cotton was kind of not cottoning on at the time because it was very difficult to clean and everything like that until the cotton gin was invented. So rice cultivation were what a lot of these plantations were doing in the Golden Isles. Yes.
How do you spell Wally?
Guale.
Guale.
Mm-hmm.
Where did they come from?
That's a good question. Guale themselves are part of the Mississippian civilization. So during the about 700 to about 1600, you had what's called the Mississippian civilization, coming, of course, out of Mississippi. The Guale were that very eastern fringe of that society. The Mississippian civilization is very famous for mound building. That's where you get Etowah mounds, Kalamoki mounds, which are also state parks.
How about the mountains in Macon?
Mountains in Macon, yeah, they're the mound building civilization. They also have this fabulous record of pottery and archaeology. And in fact, most of what we know from the Guale themselves comes from their pottery. What they would do is they had these paddles, these carved wooden paddles, and as they're making the pottery, they're slapping the wet clay with the stamp. It also gets air bubbles out of the clay so it doesn't explode in the fire. But we have these beautiful designs, and we can trace ancestry of the Guale back far enough because they passed those paddles down to their children. And the children might add to the paddles as well, but it's this clear line of art throughout time. And the Guale were very, very good at making pottery. But yes, they were closest relations might be today the Creek and Muskogee. And in fact, when they were disbanded in the 1600s, some of them probably joined up with the bigger tribes of Creek and Muskogee. But after the 1660s, Guale themselves kind of disappeared from history. Nobody claims Guale ancestry today, really. It might show up in DNA, but there's no federally recognized tribe, like you would say Cherokee or Seminole. Yeah. They're right there on the coast.
Talking about the Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
When I do my talk about Hernando de Soto, which I'm going to do probably next year here, it says in most historical records that he is the reason that Native Americans hated Europeans. And because how he treated people were just god awful.
Yeah.
And so I'll go into that next, when I do my talk on them. But you're talking about them, and so when he came to Milledgeville, he met the Acoute Indians, and that's Acute.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a couple other ones, but the Acoute was one of the bigger tribes here. He also met the Altamaha, which is down the Darien. We're talking about the Darien, and then the Appalachian. So those were that you're talking about. Those Indians were the coastal. The Appalachia started down in Florida, all the way up, and the Acoute was a part of the Appalachia / Mississippi.
Yeah, and in fact, after the Guale kind of disappeared, the Spanish turned towards the Appalachia as their next round of indentured service.
That's exactly
right.
Yeah. Yep.
Because again, the Spanish were looking at these natives going, oh, we can definitely get them to pick up agriculture the way we want it. Yep. And now they can supply all the food for St. Augustine, whether they like it or not.
That's right.
And so after the Guale kind of
Appalachia
were next on that list.
That's exactly right.
But all these natives were trying to flee from the Spaniards by moving westward as far as they could.
Very cool.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, your suit, your attire, very nice. I
Very
just
hot.
wondered,
Very hot.
Very hot, yeah.
Yeah. What time frame by the same as?
So this might be a bit different from Revolutionary War. You notice how it's longer, and by the time you start in the 1770s, it starts to shrink up the thigh a bit. This would have been 1711, 1720s. And in fact, the reason it started to shrink up a bit was that exploration into coastal Georgia and the other southern colonies. They realized it was just too hot to keep wearing all of this stuff. And it was fashion changes in the blink of an eye as well.
They also changed the wool weight.
Yes.
So in the north, you would have a 20-ounce wool weight, maybe.
This is a very light.
And this would probably be 8 to 10 ounces because it was cooler. It wasn't as heavy, so then you could kind of breathe a little extra.
They might also, instead of red pants, they might actually have like a blue waistcoat, so waistcoat, waistcoat. They might have blue underneath here and then the red coat on top of it. That was very common. They might have all white. Again, this is the Invalid Regiment at Fort King George. They get whatever they're given, pretty much. And in fact, as a soldier passed away on site, they stripped the body. And whoever was fresh off the boat, here are his old clothes, whether they fit you or not. And so they would have like a lot of mending going on, sweat stains, of course, because it's hot outside. But yeah, this is, Fort King George is not the poster child of British military wear. But definitely as you start establishing the Georgia colony, usually around 1750 is when the British Army really starts to become standardized in the way they look. A lot of officers could honestly wear whatever they wanted because they could afford to, and the enlisted soldiers were just given whatever was given to them. But around 1750, definitely by the time of the Revolutionary War, they had a standard outfit that they had to wear.
And most likely during the French and Indian War, kind of 1757, we're getting close to that. This would have been like you said, civilian or officer wear. I don't know if they had. I think that in the Revolution, not Revolution, in the French and Indian, they started putting collars on the shirt. So then this is basically the same jacket with a modified collar.
And even in Revolutionary War, what you start seeing is they pin the lapels back because it's just easier to walk through. And of course, in coastal Georgia, where you've got swampland a lot, it's hard to navigate in those reeds in that environment and all the palmetto shrub. And so then the military starts to shrink up these outfits. It's just a lot easier for them. Wool, yes.
Okay.
Wool and linen.
Yep, wool and linen. At that time, there was no cotton.
Not really, no.
Cotton wasn't being made into clothes at that time. They probably knew of the plant, but they weren't using it.
It was such a difficult, tricky plant.
Yeah.
If you use it and spin with it, it falls apart unlike wool. Wool acts like Velcro.
That's right. They have
So it's so much easier to work with compared to cotton.
Wow.
Yeah.
Any more questions?
Well, thank you so much. And if you end up coming up with questions, you can always call us up too. I mean, call up Fort King George. I'm there almost all the time.
And actually, that's how I got hold of him.
Yeah.
I called, asked some questions, and then sent an email, and within a day, I responded, and I was able to book him.
They kick me out, and I live in the barracks sometimes. Really get a feel for how those soldiers live, and so I can really tell their history.
No dysentery yet, though, right?
We don't talk about dysentery.
It's still in there.
It's still there. Oof, that was rough.
We'd like to thank Roger, Ranger Al, again for coming and presenting today.
Thank you.
I appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you.